Hey everyone, it's Alexi Uzas here from Exile Entertainment. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about surviving in the film industry during coronavirus. All right, now before we jump in and get started with the video, I want to let you know that spots are available to work with us through the Producing Accelerator program that helps filmmakers like you move your films into production while you retain full creative control of your work. So if you want to learn more about working with us and working with us through the Producing Accelerator, stick around until the end of this video. And for the best filmmaking advice, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to be notified when we post a video. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to take you through the steps that we went through in order to keep our production company alive, to make sure we survived, but in the end, how we actually ended up thriving through the pandemic and had our busiest production year to date. So when the pandemic hit in around March 2020 in Australia, when it became apparent that even though we were an island, that the pandemic or that the virus would reach us and it would have devastating effects on the industry, the first thing that we did was to actually just decide very early on to take a step back and to gather as much information as we could in order to start making informed decisions about what we were going to do next and what our strategy was going to be. So within the first kind of week or two of the pandemic hitting, one of the first things that I did was to draft an email to all the filmmakers that we were working with at that time and to basically lay out my observations of what I kind of foresaw as how the industry would kind of react to the pandemic and how we might be able to really focus on continuing to progress the films through different stages of production. So through development, through financing, and ultimately into production. The first few observations that I made, or actually you could even call these assumptions, because at that time we didn't know how things were going to play out. We were at that point making assumptions about what we thought was likely going to happen, and we were basing that on information that was coming out through different trades, through different unions, and through some of the major bodies in Australia. So the first thing, or the first assumption that we made was that rebates, so tax credits and tax incentives, were going to remain unchanged because but for the pandemic, there was no real reason for them to change. Usually tax credits and tax incentives are pretty ingrained in a territory, so it didn't really make sense that those would suddenly go away. In fact, given it wasn't direct investment, it made sense that those would actually stay around and that anyone that was able to take advantage of those would be able to. The second one is that I felt in Australia, where we have a lot of government funding, that funding wouldn't actually decrease. The reason for this was I thought that, usually government agencies have a budget that is put aside for an entire fiscal year or financial year. So again, it didn't make sense that that budget would suddenly be slashed. It might get moved to other areas, and in the case of Australia, it did. But what we saw here, which I didn't anticipate, was actually we saw a lot of government stimulus, and a lot of money actually went into production and funding development, more so than I anticipated. Another assumption that we made was that private investment overall wouldn't be affected. And the way that I came to that assumption was that I understood that certain businesses would be hit by the pandemic. There was absolutely no doubt about that. But for every action, there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. And so I thought that at the same time, there would be certain businesses that would actually thrive under this new environment. And that's actually what ended up happening. And in certain economies, we actually saw a real kind of boost in the economy during this time. So in that way, it kind of evened out overall in terms of private investment. And that's something that actually we found to be true with time, that, you know, while certain people couldn't invest in films, other people were actually in a much better financial situation. So those were three of the assumptions that I made. And then the kind of call to arms, or the email summary that I put out to the filmmakers that I was working with, was basically that, you know, we should anticipate that the industry would be shut down for at least 6 months. You know, based on what we were seeing overseas, based on the information that we were getting, we felt that it was safe to assume that there would be a period. We felt that we were going to peg it at 6 months, but there would be a period where production wouldn't happen. Rather than sit idly during that time, we felt that the best thing that we could do was focus on developing projects and focus on financing those projects. And so that's what I really implored filmmakers to do, is to spend that time being active and really focus on getting the projects ready, so that as soon as, you know, the pandemic ended, which went for much longer than we all anticipated, that we would be the first ones ready out of the gate. Because I think the fourth assumption that I made was that this pandemic would cause an undersupply of content. So because there would be many countries around the world where lockdowns were happening and that films wouldn't be made, there would be a lack of supply for content. So that basically led me to the summary that I felt that the best thing that we could do is basically get these projects ready, be the first ones out of the gate, take any windows of opportunity that we could to make the film, and then that would put us in the best position post-pandemic. And so that's the call to arms that I put out, and I'm going to run you through how things actually played out in reality in this video. Okay, so once we had our strategy down, which was halt productions for a 6-month period so that we could see how things played out, spend that time financing, developing projects, we then needed to start thinking about how we were going to actually move films into production in a safe way, in a COVID safe way. And obviously this was something that was new to everyone in the industry. What we did was rely on the guidelines that were being put out in Australia and in America, and looking at how we could apply those guidelines to our specific projects. So the two main items that we put together were a COVID safe plan and a COVID budget. Like I just mentioned, this had to be done for each project. So it wasn't enough to just have one plan that would be applicable to all projects. We actually created a company COVID safe plan as well. But then for each project, we had to make a specific plan and a specific budget. So we relied heavily on the guidelines that have been put out. And I'll put links in this video to what those guidelines were. And you can reference those yourselves. And we started to develop these COVID safe plans with the people that we're working with, so with crew or with producing partners, and we put together the COVID budgets. And then obviously once we put together COVID budgets, we had a better idea about whether that was going to affect the finance plan and whether we actually had to raise more finance for that specific project. Now, what's interesting about COVID safe plans and COVID safe budgets is that they're highly reliant, or they're highly correlated to what's actually happening with COVID in the community. So if there's really low transmission in the community, if there's very few new COVID cases every day, then your COVID safe plan is going to look very different to a situation where there's high number of cases, high number of transmission. We had a film that was due to shoot in Australia and a film that was due to shoot in Greece. And so the plans and the budgets for those two films were very different. In Australia, we were in lockdown. We were in really severe lockdowns. And so the community transmission was really low, but we couldn't make a film because we couldn't put it into production because we were all sitting at home. On the flip side, in Greece, community transmission and cases were high, but you could actually make a film. You could move the film into production. So these were two very different scenarios Of course, with the Greek film, we also had the added complication of making our first film, our first international film. So it was the first film that we were ever going to produce overseas. And so COVID added a whole nother layer to that. But that was really the next step. It was strategy, and then taking that strategy and then implementing plans and budgets that related to those plans. And then from there, having a really clear idea about how we would move the films into production when that time came. Then the next major decision that we had to make, and that you will have to make if you're trying to get a film up into production during this time, is whether to delay production or whether to actually move ahead and move the film into production. This is something, again, that you can only do once you have a clear idea about what's going on in the community, in the area that you're shooting, and of course, that you have your COVID safe plan and that you have the budget to back that up and you have the finance in place to provide for that budget. I'll give you a couple of examples of how we manage this decision about whether to delay or not. So the first one is 6 months after COVID hit and we decided to kind of put the brakes on any production. We had a film scheduled, the film that was shooting overseas, for September of that year, so exactly 9 months later. And as we're getting closer to that date, we had the finance in place to get the film into production, but we, at the time, transmission was relatively high in Greece, but wasn't out of control. In Melbourne, where I'm from and where we were living, transmission was actually going up every day, and it was hitting, I think we were at around 1,000 cases a day, which, you know, compared to some other countries obviously isn't a lot, but for us, we were used to seeing, you know, next to 0 cases every day. So this started to create a bit of concern and anxiety for us. And also at that point, you know, not many films had actually gone into production. So there weren't really many other examples that we could look to say, okay, that's how they did it. You know, there were some big productions that were able to go ahead. There were people like Tyler Perry, who was able to kind of, you know, create a fortress in his Army Fortress studio and get projects into production. But at that point, we kind of felt that we were almost guinea pigs and that we were kind of flying a bit blind. And so we just didn't feel comfortable with the level of risk that we were taking on at that time to move the film into production. We didn't feel like we had as much information as we kind of needed to get comfortable. And one of the phrases that I like to use is, you know, we had to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That level of being uncomfortable wasn't going to go away at all. If you're going to make a film during a pandemic, you're going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be stressful, but you've got to find a way to get comfortable with it. And I think that's a huge part of it. It's not just about having your COVID safe plan, having your COVID budget, but it's about you as a producer or as a production company being prepared to take on that risk, because that is a risk. There is liability associated with taking that risk. You know, financial risk in the sense of, you know, if someone gets COVID and you have to shut down, what does that look like? There's a risk of abandonment, you know, potentially too many people get sick or someone gets seriously sick and can't continue. And if the film doesn't have a completion bond, you're taking on all that risk as the producer. So basically for us, it was just too early on for us to get comfortable. And ultimately we decided to delay because of the times that we were planning to shoot, or the ideal times to shoot in Greece, which is where we were shooting. The fact that we delayed from September meant that the next window was in autumn the following year. In spring the following year. Got my seasons confused in the Southern Hemisphere. We decided that we would push it till May. That would give us ample time. It would provide the right lighting, and importantly, it would allow Europe and particularly Greece to go through winter and come out of winter. And basically, we felt that the Greek government, because it's so heavily reliant on tourism, would do what it did the first year, which was to leave tourism open, leave the country open, and try and stimulate the economy in that way. We felt that it would do that the following year. So we felt the closer that we could get to the opening of the European summer, the more chance that we would have for Greece and Athens to be open. As it played out, Greece did go into lockdown over winter. Cases actually were rising leading into summer, and there were some really, really heavy restrictions in place. But those restrictions did ease up the closer that it got to our shoot date and the closer that it got to summer. Also thinking about how the government has been acting, using their previous decision making to help try and, inform or project how they were going to, or how they're likely to make future decisions, is something that you should be keeping in mind as well when you're making the decision about whether to delay or not. Other project that we had was happening in Australia, and that was due to go into production in March of 2021, so almost a year after kind of COVID hit. And at that time, we were coming out of summer in Australia, and so transmission was quite low at the time. And so we felt comfortable, given transmission was so low, everything was pretty much open. I think even at that time, we might not have even been wearing masks. So we felt comfortable moving the film into production, and we felt that we had a window where even if cases started to rise, we would likely have enough lead-in time before, really strict lockdown came into place. That gave us the confidence to move ahead. As it happened in the second week of pre-production, cases started to go up and we had a snap 5-day lockdown. So everyone had to work from home, kind of statewide, and this gave us, a lot of concern. But we were able to continue working during pre-production. What we didn't know was what the outcome of that lockdown would be, and whether the government would continue to lock us down like it had in the past. So it caught us by surprise, but thankfully the 5-day lockdown kind of, we got on top of the community transmission, and by the end of that it was clear that we had gotten on top of it. And because the government previously had given us these short lockdowns that then just kind of kept going and kept going and kept going, we're actually in one right now. Because they didn't do that time, because it ended after those 5 days, we felt confident that they had gotten on top of it and they weren't going to put us straight back into a lockdown. Again, you're running the gauntlet. We had to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So there was no guarantee that we would make it through, but we had to use all the information that we had. We had to, be satisfied with the preparation that we'd made. We had to be satisfied with our COVID budget. We had to be satisfied with our finance plan. We had to be satisfied that we had enough contingency in the budget, not just COVID budget, but actually contingency to help deal with any serious events. And all those things combined, as well as looking at what the government was doing, looking at community transmission, using all that information, that's how we were able to come to the conclusion, or come to the decision on 2 occasions, to move those films into production, to take those windows of opportunity. And thankfully, I've said the filmmaking gods were on our side for both films, and we were able to get those films through production, and now they're both in post-production. Okay, so just a quick recap. I hope that by taking you through the way that we made decisions during coronavirus, that's given you a bit of a framework through which you can make your own decisions. But yeah, to recap again, the main points were: number 1, take a step back, gather as much information as you can and that is available to you that's going to help you make informed decisions. Number 2, don't sit idly. Right? Use this time to either develop or finance your projects so that you can be ready to move your films into production once things really open up. We're not even through the pandemic yet. And so you might be living in a country right now, or a city or a state that is in lockdown. Or you might be in a place where, the film industry isn't back in full swing. Either way, you want to spend this time getting those projects ready so that you're one of the first out of the gate. Number 3, get your COVID safe plan and your COVID budget down, and make sure that you have enough finance to cover that COVID budget, and make sure you have a really good amount of contingency in your budget. Number 4 is you're gonna need to decide whether to delay the production or whether to move it ahead. So I encourage you to use some of the factors that I gave you in this video to help arrive at that decision. And then when the stars do line up, number 5 is make sure you take that window of opportunity and get the film into production. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you liked the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, throw some comments in the comments section below, and let me know if there's any other information that you need from me to help you make a decision about moving your film into production during COVID. I'd also love to hear about any of the films that you have managed to get into production during this time. Now, if you're currently developing or financing your film and you want to move it into production during COVID, during the pandemic, or of course, depending on when you're watching this video, after the pandemic, then I encourage you to head to the link in the description below where you can find out more information about working with us through the Producing Accelerator program. That program teaches filmmakers like you how to finance, produce, and attach distribution to your films on a consistent basis so that you can start to build a career in the film industry or start to build your own production company. And don't forget to check out these videos next on how to up your filmmaking game.